A man named Chris works as a deep-sea diver. He is trained in saturation diving and is part of a special crew that fixes pipes deep in the ocean. He recently bought a new home and is about to marry a beautiful woman named Morag. One day, Chris comes home and tells Morag that he has to go on another mission. He will be gone for a month. He asks her to make the house feel like home until he returns. Even though the job is one of the most dangerous in the world, Morag lets him go because this is what he signed up for. Next, Chris heads to Aberdeen Harbor. This place is the main station for North Sea diving operations. Then he boards their ship, which has just finished getting updated, and greets the crew members. After everyone settles in, the dive supervisor, Craig, gives a briefing. He tells them they will be pressurized down to 300 feet to replace a section of a pipeline. After they finish the job, they will have 4 days to decompress before going home. Chris is assigned to a team with 2 men named Duncan and Dave. Then Chris and his team enter the pressurized chamber and start to get comfortable. But Dave acts harsh toward Chris, since they have never met before. Duncan explains that Dave is like this because he wants to stay focused. He has 2 kids and wants to survive for them. Later, the chamber doors lock and the compression begins. The ship starts moving toward the damaged pipeline location. After they reach the oil rig,
we find ourselves at the bottom of the world.
Craig tells everyone that the diving will happen in pitch black and freezing water. He warns them not to leave the chamber early. If they do, the gas in their bodies will expand fast and tear them apart. One day, Duncan, who is the oldest in the team, shares a story with Chris and Dave. He says that in his early days, there were no chambers. Divers only use skill and intelligence. He also says this will be his last rotation because the company wants him to retire. That night, Chris receives a video message from Morag. He watches it and starts to miss her even more. Later, the ship docks with the oil rig, and they finally get ready for the diving operations. The first team to go down is Chris's team. They quickly but carefully put on their diving gear. Then, they enter their pod and get ready to be lowered into the water. Next, the pod slowly goes down until it reaches the manifold, which is 200 feet below. After that, they open the hatch and test the water. It is freezing cold. Next, Dave gets ready to enter the water, and Duncan helps him with the process. After putting on the helmet, Dave slowly goes into the water. Then Chris follows and enters without any problems, while Duncan watches over them. After that, the 2 divers descend down the manifold, and someone throws them a power cable. They connect it to the manifold in front of them, and suddenly, light appears everywhere. But the light is not strong enough to clear the darkness of the seabed. Next, Chris slowly moves through the pipes and finds the spot where the pressure is rising. He starts adjusting it while Dave stays close by. Just then, the ship starts reading strange numbers. Suddenly, the dynamic positioning operator reports that the system is failing. Without it, the ship's thrusters stop working, and the ship begins to drift. Craig, the dive supervisor, the ship's captain, Andre, and the first officer, Hannah, all rush to fix the issue. Meanwhile, Dave tells Chris to get out of the maze of pipes quickly. The mission is now canceled. The team's new goal is to get the divers out before they become trapped on the seabed. Next, Chris and Dave reach the extraction point, but their pod is no longer in the right place. Then Chris sees that his cord is tangled. He might not be able to escape. At the same time, Duncan is panicking in the sea. He keeps feeding more cord to prevent the pod from pulling Chris and Dave too hard. Soon, the cord reaches its full length, and the ship finally stops drifting. Chris's tangled cord is acting like an anchor, but then his gas line breaks, and he runs out of air. He switches to his emergency air supply, but it only gives him 10 minutes. After that, Chris's cord snaps, and he falls back down to the seabed. The ship keeps drifting farther away. Dave climbs back using his own cord and manages to return to the pod. Meanwhile, Craig loses contact with both the divers and the pod. However, Dave finally returns to the pod and tells Duncan what happened to Chris. Then Craig tells Andre to drop the anchor and try to rescue Chris. But Andre refuses. He says there are too many pipelines on the seabed, and dropping the anchor could cause an environmental disaster. Meanwhile, Chris lies on the seabed, surrounded by pitch-black darkness and total silence. He has only 8 minutes of oxygen left. He lights a flare, but it is not enough to figure out where he is. He tries to find the manifold where he fell, because that is the only place the team might find him. On the ship, the systems begin working again. Andre suggests moving the ship manually without using the dynamic positioning system. But Hannah warns him that manual controls are meant for port use only. One wrong move could put the whole ship in danger. However, Andre says if they keep drifting, they may never find Chris. Hannah agrees, and together, they take control of the ship and stop it from drifting. Meanwhile, Chris now has only 5 minutes of oxygen left. He keeps looking for the manifold. After some searching, he finds it and tries to climb it using its rough surface. But he drops his flare and has to light another one to keep going. He finally reaches the top of the manifold, but his oxygen is running out. He starts seeing visions of his wife in his head. Back in the pod, Dave thinks Chris is already dead, but Duncan still has hope. On the ship, they send a remote drone into the water to search for Chris. After some time, they spot him lying on top of the manifold. He is struggling to breathe and stay alive. The drone gets closer, and Craig sees that Chris's eyes are closed, but his body is still intact. However, he is not breathing and is having spasms because his brain is not getting enough oxygen. He has been without air for nearly 8 minutes. Next, the dynamic positioning operator tells Andre that the system is stuck because it is routed through a startup CPU. He offers to bypass it by rewiring everything. Andre agrees and gives him permission. Meanwhile, Craig asks the drone pilot, Andrew, to use the drone to carry Chris back to the pod. But Andrew refuses. He says the drone is only built to carry dead bodies, and carrying a live person is too risky. Then Craig says he is responsible for Chris's life and decides to take control of the drone himself. Craig carefully tries to control the drone to grab Chris, but he fails several times. Then he focuses fully and makes small, careful adjustments. Slowly, he moves the drone toward Chris's shoulder belt and finally grabs it successfully. However, when Craig tries to pull Chris upward, nothing happens. He checks the bottom camera and sees that Chris has clipped himself to the manifold. Chris did this to avoid getting washed away by the ocean current. It is a smart move, but now it is stopping Craig from moving him. Craig gently sets Chris back down and unhooks the drone from him. Now, Chris has been without oxygen for 17 minutes. Everyone begins to lose hope. Then Duncan starts telling Dave a story about how he first met Chris. It happened during a rescue mission. They were sent to recover the bodies of fishermen who were out catching lobsters. Most of the bodies were found, but one was missing. They believed the ocean current had taken it. So instead of searching longer, they gave the man's wife a shoebox filled with his personal items. Duncan says he refuses to give Morag a shoebox. They must bring Chris back. Meanwhile, the dynamic positioning operator is sweating as he carefully rewires every cable in the system. Finally, he finishes the work. Luckily, it works, and the dynamic positioning system comes back online. Andre orders the team to move the ship back to the manifold. Power and communication are restored in the pod. Craig contacts Duncan for the first time in a long while and tells him they are heading back to find Chris. Next, Dave puts on his diving gear and goes back into the ocean. He reaches the manifold, finds Chris, and quickly unclips him. Then he grabs Chris and starts the journey back to the pod. Suddenly, the ship's thrusters stop again. The pod begins swinging and almost crushes both men against the manifold. But Dave manages to protect Chris and pull them both to safety. Now Dave must use all his strength to climb the cord back to the pod. The whole crew watches closely. Dave's arms are tired, but his strong will to save both himself and Chris pushes him forward. He reaches the bottom of the pod and pulls Chris up with him. Then he attaches the winch to Chris, and Duncan pulls him into the pod. Once inside, Duncan gently removes Chris's helmet and begins CPR. Chris has been without oxygen for over 29 minutes. He is still fighting to stay alive. Duncan does not give up. He keeps pumping oxygen into Chris's lungs, hoping to bring him back. Finally, Chris starts to breathe again, and Dave gets out of the water too. Duncan helps Dave take off his helmet and tells the ship that Chris is breathing, but not responsive. Duncan tries to talk to Chris, but Chris stays frozen. His brain has not received oxygen for nearly 30 minutes. Dave also tries to reach him, but Chris does not respond. Dave starts to think they are too late. Duncan feels emotional, but is still glad they were able to bring Chris back. Then all of a sudden, Chris says Dave's name, and Dave and Duncan are filled with joy. Craig asks what is going on, and Duncan tells him that Chris is now responsive and talking. The whole crew on the ship celebrates. Their hard work has paid off. The captain congratulates everyone and says they are finally going home. Craig closes the pod hatch and brings the divers back to their pressurized chamber. Inside the chamber, Chris cannot sleep. Dave checks on him. When Dave tells him that he was out for nearly 40 minutes, Chris is shocked. He says he feels like he let Morag down because he almost left her alone. But when he passed out, he felt complete peace. It was not painful. He then thanks Dave for saving his life and finally falls asleep. Dave quietly pulls out pictures of his daughters and realizes how close he also came to never seeing them again. On the second day of decompression, Chris calls Morag. She is surprised to hear his voice because she thought it would take weeks. He tells her there was a problem with the ship but says he will be back the day after tomorrow. After their final day of decompression, Chris and the others leave the chamber, but Duncan stays behind. It is his last day at work. He looks around the chamber one last time. This is the place where he always felt alive, but now it is time for him to retire. Next, Chris finally goes home and reunites with Morag. He tells her everything that happened and how he was rescued. She cannot believe he survived such a close call. Chris promises her that no matter what, he will always come back home. This is the true story of Chris Lemons, who lost his oxygen supply for nearly 30 minutes during a deep sea dive. Yet he suffered no lasting physical or mental damage. Scientists believe his survival may be due to a rare combination of extreme depth and cold temperatures. But even now, no one can fully explain how he lived. 3 weeks after the accident, Chris, Dave, and Duncan returned to the bottom of the North Sea to finish the job they started. The end. Thank you for watching. Be sure to like our channel and subscribe if you enjoy content like this. Also, let us know what movie you would love us to recap for you.